Sometimes unraveling a case can be so challenging that even experienced professionals make mistakes. Today's stories are about inaccuracies and errors that nearly allowed the guilty party to escape deserved punishment. Fortunately, persistent investigators refused to accept this turn of events and ultimately, even if it took years, achieved justice. In the early morning of October 31, 2019, 26-year-old Colby Trickle called 911 emergency services. He reported that his wife Kristina had shot herself in the head with a revolver. Law enforcement officers and a medical team immediately headed to the scene. Colby was waiting for the officers outside the house. The police sergeant, who was the first to arrive and see the victim, suddenly noticed signs of life in the young woman. He set the revolver aside and moved 26-year-old Kristina from the bed to the living room to position her body more conveniently for first aid. At that very moment, the police officer noticed that she had only one gunshot wound. The bullet had entered her head from below, on the side of her chin. The officer tried to perform artificial respiration, but by the time the medics arrived, she had already stopped breathing. It was no longer possible to save her. After that, the law enforcement officer went out on the porch and informed Colby about his wife's death. He burst into tears and agreed to go to the station to talk to the detectives. Interestingly, up until that point, he had been outside the whole time calmly talking to the police officers about some abstract topics. Initially, the coroner assumed that the young woman had committed suicide using a firearm. However, during the investigation, law enforcement officials began to suspect it may have been staged. From the very beginning, the police noticed several strange circumstances surrounding the incident. First of all, Kristina was dressed only in her underwear and had severely disfigured her face as a result of the gunshot. From a psychological perspective, women who decide to voluntarily take their own lives usually do not act in this manner. They generally dress carefully and avoid damaging their face, as they are concerned about their appearance even after death. In the vast majority of female suicide cases, they choose poisoning, hanging or, at most, shooting themselves in other parts of the body that do not disfigure the face, such as the heart. Moreover, the weapon found directly on the victim's stomach seemed too bulky and awkward for a delicate girl like Kristina to use effectively. Even more suspicion arose when the police checked the deceased's cell phone. As it turned out, she had an alarm set for the next morning, which meant she was going to wake up and go about her daily business, not planning to die. It appeared the young woman had plans for the future and was unlikely to have truly intended to kill herself. Naturally, the first suspicion fell on her husband, Colby Trickle. At the station, the 26-year-old husband of the deceased stated that a few hours before the tragedy, Kristina had returned from the Walmart store where she worked as a saleswoman in the garden department. After that, they played some video games, and then Colby went to sleep since he had to get up early for business. His wife continued to do routine household chores. Some time later, he woke up from a loud sound followed by ringing in his ears. It was a deafening noise that disoriented Colby. As soon as he came to his senses, he saw his wife lying next to him on the bed with a gunshot wound to her head. He said he immediately tried to revive her but to no avail. His wife simply stared at him with blank eyes. After that, Colby called 911. He tried to feel for his wife's pulse but could not find one. According to the young man's confession, he then took the revolver and wanted to take his own life, not imagining how he would live without his beloved wife. Right during the conversation with the dispatcher, he began to put the barrel to his temple. But in the end, he abandoned this intention, as the operator said that Kristina might still be helped and saved. Colby then placed the gun on his wife's stomach and went outside to meet the emergency responders. However, he did not try to perform CPR or stop the bleeding, nor did he check Kristina's condition when the police arrived at the house. His behavior seemed strange. Loving husbands usually make every effort to help their injured wife, not leave her to fend for herself. When questioned, Colby referred to the state of shock he was in. The widower denied involvement in his wife's death, but the police were troubled by the question, why then was Colby not present during the attempt to resuscitate his wife and indifferently remained outside the house the whole time? At that moment, the man was casually talking to other officers, not even about his wife, but about video games, as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened in his life. The police asked if there was any insurance policy taken out on the victim. Colby denied this but said he was supposed to receive some payouts from the U.S. Armed Forces. According to him, it was an insignificant amount. Colby spoke with investigators for over 11 hours, and the longer it went on, the more suspicions the law enforcement officers had about him. He immediately began talking about his achievements in the Army, how he had participated in special operations in the Middle East and Central America, calling himself a scout. Although it later turned out that this was all a lie and he had no connection to military intelligence. In addition, Colby began to say that his wife had suffered from depressive moods, which could have led to the tragic end of her life. The widower behaved suspiciously, but there was no evidence against him. Therefore, the detectives were forced to continue the investigation and begin searching among those closest to the deceased. By that time, the victim's relatives had already been informed about what had happened, but they did not agree with Colby's version that his wife had voluntarily taken her own life. They described the deceased as a person who never gave up in the face of difficulties, never ran away from problems, and did not suffer from mental disorders or harmful addictions. On the contrary, she was a cheerful, very positive young woman who had no serious issues in her life that would require shooting herself in the head. Her loved ones believed that she would have never taken her own life, as she dearly loved her family and 2 dogs. At the very least, she would not have done so without ensuring her pet's future well-being. In general, there were no preconditions for such radical actions. In fact, it was difficult to find a photo where Kristina was not smiling. That's how much of an optimist she was, maintaining a positive attitude even in the most challenging situations. And this was despite the fact that she had quite a difficult childhood. When the girl was only 2 years old, her mother left her and her father, and he raised his daughter alone until he died when she was 17. Kristina then moved in with her uncle and aunt, the Rice family, who had 3 children of their own. There, the girl finally felt cared for, loved, and was happy. Kristina sincerely loved her uncle and aunt and was glad to become part of their family. The relatives, as well as their children, reciprocated her affection. She was a wonderful daughter and a reliable older sister who always supported her loved ones. Even during the challenging teenage years that many go through, the story's heroine remained compliant and calm, never running away from home. On the contrary, it seemed that she only grew closer to her new family. Kristina met Colby at church when they were both 18 years old. At that time, the young man played in the church music group that accompanied the services. He immediately impressed the girl with his guitar-playing skills and original songs. From a young age, the boy was diligent and energetic, with music being his passion. When Colby came of age, he became interested in a military career and joined the army. He signed several contracts and achieved some success in the service. Eventually, Colby transferred to the Army Reserve and began devoting more time to music. He graduated from college and settled in the small town of Hays, Kansas. The young man performed cover versions of popular songs at various parties. He was often invited to perform at various events, including at the church where he met Kristina. Only 5 years passed, and the young woman was found dead in her own bed. The police immediately began analyzing the circumstances of the tragedy. The medical examiner, considering the location of the entry wound and the bullet's trajectory, concluded that the revolver would have had to be parallel to the body, tightly pressed against the chin, to cause such an injury by oneself. Doing so would be extremely inconvenient, and the traces left by the shot seemed inconsistent with such a scenario, which was atypical for this method of suicide. Moreover, the gun looked too large. It was hard to imagine how a physically delicate girl could have used it. We are talking about a full-size .350 caliber revolver with a barrel length of about 30 centimeters. Everything in the house indicated ordinary daily affairs. Halloween candies were laid out on the kitchen table. It seemed that Kristina was preparing for the holiday, which clearly did not align with the circumstances of her death. By that time, law enforcement officials had already found out that all the stories about overseas military assignments and intelligence activities were fabricated. The leadership of the unit in which the story's hero served stated that he had never been involved in any such operations. His lies about working in military intelligence seemed completely out of place. This could indicate that the detectives were dealing with a pathological liar. Despite this, Colby gave the impression of a well-mannered former serviceman who loved his wife very much, or at least he tried to create such an image. Interestingly, when analyzing each episode of the young man's behavior, the detectives were left with an ambiguous impression. For example, why put the revolver on his wife's stomach after talking to the dispatcher? Why back on the body and not on the floor? Could this have been part of the staging? During the same period, while the interrogation was underway, forensic specialists were working at the scene of the alleged murder. A warrant was obtained to seize the suspect's mobile phone. It was assumed that the incident could have resulted from a marital conflict that got out of control, and the possibility of domestic violence was considered. Arguments against such assumptions included the fact that no defensive wounds were found on Kristina's body, nor were there any signs of a struggle in the house. In addition to looking for obvious traces on the body, the medical examiner analyzed the victim's condition, trying to identify possible signs of past physical abuse. Usually, if a husband and wife regularly fight, with one beating the other, traces of injuries can be found on the body, the severity of which gradually increases. This indicates the systematic nature of domestic violence. However, no bruises at various stages of healing were found on Kristina. Based on this, the medical examiner concluded that Colby was telling the truth and Kristina had indeed taken her own life. This came as a real shock to the investigators. By this point, the detectives had gathered enough contradictory data and were convinced that the victim had been murdered. Unfortunately, the medical examiner's conclusion could create serious obstacles in the fight for justice, but a clue was provided by the deceased's relatives. Everyone knew that Kristina was afraid of firearms and had never used them. It was strange to assume that she could have chosen such an unpleasant method for her to end her life. Moreover, she was modest and shy, so it seemed illogical that she would have taken her own life while undressed. This did not fit the psychological profile of a woman who voluntarily takes her life. Considering the same concern for appearance, many suicide victims reach a state where they become indifferent to being unclothed. The Rice family, in which Kristina grew up, pointed to obvious signs of Colby's controlling behavior. The young man did not like it when his wife was out of his sight for a long time. If she did not answer his first call to her cell phone, the husband would immediately fly into a rage. Colby did not resort to physical violence but enjoyed exerting moral pressure and manipulation. After talking to the detectives, the Rices replied that the only person they suspected of involvement in what happened was Colby. The uncle and aunt also emphasized that the longer Kristina was in a relationship with this young man, the worse her relationship with her family became. Recently, she had significantly distanced herself from them and rarely communicated. They were convinced that her husband was turning Kristina against her family. Such behavior is characteristic of an abuser and manipulator. But the most interesting detail was her desire to gain more freedom in this marriage, which she spoke about shortly before the tragedy. She complained to her relatives that she was fed up with her husband's behavior and wanted to restore her relationship with her family. When Kristina and Colby got married on April 25, 2014, she moved to Kansas City, which is almost 500 kilometers away. The couple's life together, according to the deceased's uncle, was not easy. Colby was in the Army Reserve, working irregularly since then, earning little, but not even trying to find a steady job. His wife, meanwhile, got a job at a veterinary clinic because she loved animals very much, but money was tight. They then returned to the city where Kristina grew up, Hays, Kansas. She started working at Walmart and virtually supported herself and her husband. The financial situation gradually improved. In early 2019, she visited her relatives. According to them, everything was as it had been during the years of living together, as if she had never left their home. This happened just a few months before her death. During this period, Kristina was full of inspiration and, given her love for animals, planned to open a shelter. There was an old house south of the city. She wanted to convert a small barn on the property into a shelter for abandoned pets. While examining the main suspect's cell phone, detectives discovered that he had been flirting with another woman via messages. Also, during the phone examination, they were able to find a refutation of the former serviceman's words. As it turned out, he was indeed the beneficiary of his wife's life insurance policy. Even two of them. First, there was special insurance for the wives of military personnel. Second, shortly before the tragedy, Kristina's employer had taken out a life insurance policy on her. Colby had previously claimed that these were insignificant amounts, but that was untrue. The browser history showed that shortly before his wife's death, he had tried to find out how much would be paid out in the event of her death. Almost immediately after his wife's death, the young man applied for payouts from the two insurance policies where he was listed as the beneficiary. $23,000 came from the store where his wife worked. Another $100,000 came from the U.S. Armed Forces. In total, the payouts amounted to $123,000, and all this money was spent almost instantly. Interestingly, his purchases were very different from what widowed husbands who are genuinely grieving the loss of a loved one usually buy. Colby bought himself a sex doll for about $2,000. And this happened just 2 days after his wife's death. Then the former serviceman paid off his debts, bought a lot of new video games and professional music equipment for his creative work. He spent the rest of the money on entertainment. The man did not mourn or grieve his wife's death at all, which looked extremely suspicious. Kristina's behavior was not typical for someone who had decided to voluntarily end their life, and Colby did not at all resemble a grieving widower. His purchases were too frivolous for someone mourning a loss. But there was no direct evidence against him to press charges. Although he became the main suspect, surveillance of Colby continued for quite a long time. All of this was necessary to gather evidence against the likely killer. In mid-November 2019, Colby found himself being interrogated again. When asked about the insurance, Colby stated that Kristina herself could have used his phone to find out the amount of her insurance. According to him, they freely used each other's mobile devices. He admitted that a few months before the tragedy, he had met another girl who was into video games. And they began an innocent flirtation and online communication. His wife did not know about this connection. He called this relationship an ordinary online flirtation that would not have transitioned into real life. But as it turned out, Colby was literally obsessed with the new girl. He constantly corresponded with her. This continued even during the first interrogation when Colby was at the police station. After the suspect left the second interrogation, the police began checking his new testimony. It turned out that at the moment when the request about the amount of insurance was made from Colby's cell phone, his wife was actually at work. Of course, she could not have used his phone in any way. They even managed to obtain video recordings showing her performing her usual duties at the store without touching any mobile devices. So, Colby had lied again. Another dubious claim by the young man was the story that his wife kept the revolver by the bed. He had voiced this version during his first interaction with the investigators. Unfortunately, due to the medical examiner's conclusion about voluntary death, the police could not conduct a full search of the house. The detectives had to make do with photographs taken on the day the body was discovered and archival pictures of the young Trickle couple. While viewing the photographs, several firearms were found that were indeed kept in the couple's bedroom. But the revolver itself was on the husband's side. This was confirmed by several photographs of the house found on the main suspect's cell phone. The forensic specialists still faced a serious obstacle in the form of the medical examiner's conclusion that Kristina had taken her own life. They felt significant limitations in obtaining a warrant to search the house for evidence. In fact, law enforcement officers were never able to enter the victim's house to conduct a search. Despite all these contradictions, the police still did not arrest the widower. Surveillance of him continued, even a year after Kristina's death. He led a normal life, denying himself nothing, and continued to participate in musical events. It was only 2 years after the woman's death that the prosecutor's office decided to take new measures. This was due to a change in the district attorney, who took office in January 2021. The detectives who had been investigating Kristina's death appealed directly to him, stating their confidence that it was a deliberate attack by her husband. Law enforcement officers asked for help in putting the killer behind bars. To support their words, the police demonstrated all the strange aspects of the case. Colby had a strong motive. He had fully taken advantage of the money received, denying himself nothing, showing no grief, and lying a lot. Moreover, Kristina clearly had not intended to die. She had plans for the next day. Judging by her relatives' words, the victim had plans not only for tomorrow but for her entire life, which was tragically cut short, clearly not of her own volition. The new district attorney took an interest in this suspicious incident, especially the behavior of the young widower, and gave the green light. Finally, on July 14, 2021, 21 months after Kristina's death, Colby was arrested and charged with first-degree murder and obstruction of justice. In fact, during the arrest, Colby behaved as if it was not something unexpected for him. He was detained while driving through the city in his car. The young man did not put up any resistance. Colby's team of lawyers immediately began to develop a defense strategy. They emphasized that this was a devoted Christian, a military man, a musician, and a loving husband. According to the defense, the deceased had suffered from depression and problems with her parents from an early age. They referred to her difficult childhood and believed that the girl had faced much greater difficulties and emotional pain than was commonly thought. She had been rejected by her own mother, then her father died, and she was forced to live with her uncle and aunt. In the end, Kristina simply could not bear it and decided to take her own life. In addition to the lawyers' convincing arguments, the prosecution still had a serious problem in the form of the medical examiner's conclusion about voluntary death. Therefore, it was decided to reject the results of the examination and rely on psychological analysis. Of course, this imposed significant limitations on the work of the prosecution. A difficult trial was expected, based on indirect evidence. To convince the jury of the guilt of the cunning killer, a forensic psychiatrist was involved. The specialist's task was to analyze the girl's state before her death and find answers to the question of whether she could have really killed herself. The psychiatrist began to carefully study all available sources of information about the victim. He analyzed her social media pages, the deceased's personal diaries, and also talked with everyone she had been in contact with during the last days of her life. The final conclusions of this specialist became the basis on which the prosecution relied in court. Finally, in September 2023, the hearings began. The prosecution insisted that Colby had brutally murdered his wife for financial gain. Moreover, it was believed that his online flirtation was something much more serious than the accused claimed. He had become so infatuated with the new girl that he decided to get rid of his annoying wife. The defense tried to refute the claim that the young man had planned the murder. According to his own words, Colby did not remember searching the browser for information about his wife's insurance amount. Around that time, he was filling out some documents for the armed forces, so maybe that's why he was interested in the payout amounts, to enter them into the papers. The lawyers considered it a mere coincidence, but the prosecutors insisted it was part of a carefully thought-out plan. The defendant admitted to the jury that he had indeed received over $120,000 in insurance payouts. By the start of the hearings, he had managed to spend the entire sum on various needs but saw nothing suspicious about it. One purchase that most interested the trial participants was a life-size realistic sex doll. The defendant did not hide this purchase, claiming that he had trouble sleeping and needed someone to hug, and the doll helped him cope with these difficulties. It was also strange that he discussed this purchase with his mother, and she actively defended her son in court, particularly supporting his version about being afraid to sleep alone. Testimony was given on the side of the prosecution by those close to the deceased. According to her uncle, a few months before the tragedy, Kristina had become more persistent and demanding in her relationship with her husband. Before that, she had allowed herself to be manipulated by him for a long time, but now she decided to fight back, as she was tired of constant prohibitions. She talked about this a lot with her family. Her uncle, aunt, and brothers were sincerely proud that she had learned to stand up for herself. No one could have imagined that the desire for independence could cost her life. Immediately after that, the forensic psychiatrist spoke. He had done a tremendous amount of work and was able to thoroughly analyze the victim's psychological state. In addition to real evidence that Colby was losing control over his wife, which caused him anxiety, Kristina had grand plans for the future. She was full of optimism, dreaming of opening an animal shelter. Her goals and dreams had begun to come to life. It was found that she knew about her husband's relationships on the side, which had started online. Judging by the messages in the messengers, the last time they talked about it was less than a week before the tragedy occurred. Thus, another contradiction was revealed in the young man's words. After all, earlier during the interrogation, he claimed that his wife knew nothing about it, and it was his little but innocent secret from her. In any case, the forensic psychiatrist concluded that at the time of her death, the victim could not have been in a state that could lead to a voluntary departure from life. She had no reason to take her own life. The lawyers considered the involvement of a psychiatric expert a mistake. The defense insisted that he had not spoken to the victim personally and could not know what was really going on in her soul. He had not even contacted the people close to her immediately after the crime. Over time, memories tend to change and become overgrown with speculation, which could call the expert's conclusions into question. Then the prosecution used another trump card that was to become decisive in the killer's verdict. The jurors were shown the revolver, the murder weapon, stating that the woman physically could not have used such a massive firearm. Right in the courtroom, they demonstrated the position of the barrel from which the bullet hit Kristina's chin. She was right-handed, so if the revolver had been on her bedside table, as Colby claimed, the direction of the bullet's entry would have been mirrored. During the investigation and ballistic examinations, forensic experts concluded that the location of the entry hole and the bullet's trajectory corresponded to the fact that the weapon was actually on Colby's nightstand. He simply took it, turned to his sleeping wife, put the barrel to her chin, and pulled the trigger. On November 20, 2023, the jury left to deliberate the verdict. In less than 2 hours, they returned. Colby Trickle was found guilty of first-degree murder and obstruction of justice. To the very end, he never admitted his guilt, although he did note that he could have been a better husband. The judge sentenced him to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 50 years. After that, the question arose of correcting the information about the cause of death on the young woman's death certificate. The medical examiner stated that he had not received sufficient grounds to change his initial decision. Fortunately, this did not prevent justice from being served. Kristina's brothers often drive past the same house where she dreamed of opening her shelter. Despite the fact that justice prevailed, the world lost a kind and bright person. For the Rice family, it will never be the same. Please write your thoughts and reactions in the comments below. For those who are new here, subscribing is the best way to stay updated on future content. Also give a like please. Take care of yourself and your loved ones. Thank you for your support during this difficult time. Until next time, friends.